Dzień dobry Państwu, nazywam się Mateusz Chaberski i witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie na kolejnej rozmowie wokół książki wydanej przez wydawnictwo Uniwersytetu Jagiellońskiego pod nową marką bowiem. Będziemy rozmawiać o książce Na zawsze w lodzie, śladami tragicznej wyprawy Johna Franklina, autorstwa Owena Beattiego i Johna Geigera. I o tej książce, o tej niezwykle fascynującej książce będę miał przyjemność porozmawiać z Johnem Geigerem, historykiem, pisarzem, dziennikarzem, dyrektorem generalnym Królewskiego Towarzystwa Geograficznego. Oprócz tej książki John Geiger był współautorem wielu książek, które przetłumaczono na 14 języków. Jest też Senior Fellow Massey College Uniwersytetu Toronto i został też uhonorowany medalem polarnym. Książka, jak się Państwo od razu domyślacie, opowiada o jednej z największych wypraw polarnych do Arktyki w historii wypraw organizowanych przez Wielką Brytanię w XIX wieku pod dowództwem Sir Johna Franklina i jej celem było odkrycie morskiej drogi z Europy do Azji, wiodącej przez tak zwane Przejście Północno-Zachodnie, wiodące przez ekstremalnie niegościnny Ocean Arktyczny. Wyprawa ta jest owiana wieloma legendami, a nasz gość jest jedną z tych osób, która pomogła wyjaśnić to, dlaczego dwa statki podróżników, Terror i Erebus, zniknęły bez śladu, a cała wyprawa zakończyła się gehenną i śmiercią wszystkich jej uczestników. Hi, John. Thanks for your time and that you had the time to join us today.
It's great to meet you digitally, Matt.
Yeah. I must say, what a fascinating read. And I was really astonished that the book, Frozen in Time, this is the English title, was first published in 1987. And this is the Polish edition was translated from its if I count well, the 6th edition from 2017. Why do you think the story of Sir John Franklin's lost expedition has held people's attention, not only for the last 30 years, but ever since the 1840s? Why is that, do you think?
Well, it's just the scale of the disaster. You know, it's the greatest polar exploration disaster in history. The loss of 2 ships, all the men on those ships, and then the mystery surrounding their disappearance. You know, with other expeditions where you know there was calamity, there invariably was an explanation as to what had happened. In many instances where there were polar wrecks, people did survive. An example is Sir John Ross's expedition. So there are examples where people were in terrible situations, ships were lost. But people ended up, surviving. In the case of Franklin, there were no survivors. So there was this incredible vacuum of knowledge, and so the mystery has remained, and to even persist to this day, even though we now know so much more than we did, obviously, in the decades following the disappearance.
It's interesting that you're saying about the vacuum of knowledge, because from your book, it transpires that that actually the Franklin lost expedition actually stimulated the exploration in the Arctic of the British Empire. Would you say that this great calamity was in some ways productive or positive for the advancement of the sciences?
Oh, absolutely. The fact that Franklin and the ships were lost, as you say, stimulated one of the greatest maritime and overland rescue missions, if you want to call it that, imaginable. Ships coming through the Pacific into the Arctic, through the Atlantic, overland explorers like John Ray coming, from the southern part of Canada. The discovery and the mapping of islands, the interaction with indigenous peoples who were already, of course, living, in the high Arctic. So it really did shed an incredible light on that part of the world that was known to the Inuit, but was not known to people outside of that region. So it was an incredibly important period in terms of exploration history. It's a very complicated bit of geography. Just anyone looking at a map, looking at the Canadian Arctic archipelago, will see just how complicated it is. And really, it wasn't until as late as the 1920s that we finally kind of had a final sense of islands. There were still islands being discovered in the 19 teens by people like Stephenson. So really, it's a remarkable part of the world. It was little known at that time, and Franklin's disappearance did ignite this incredible focus scientifically and in terms of pure exploration. And the fact that the Arctic archipelago is Canadian today is largely, I think, due to the work that was done searching for Franklin.
That's interesting. I'm going to come back to this point, the latest point. But first, I must say that your book and tell another story. It doesn't focus solely on Franklin, but it tells another yet equally, in my opinion, compelling tale or story of your co-author, the Owen Beatty's expedition to actually solve the mystery of the Franklin's expedition, and it took part in 1980s. And could you please tell our viewers, with hindsight, what was the most important finding of Owen Beatty's team? And I presume you were in some ways a part of this team or expedition, right?
I was not actually with him in the field at that point. Later, we spent 3 field seasons together, but Owen had a very novel idea. And that was that he was a forensic anthropologist. He is a forensic anthropologist. His interest is in often assisting with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, as an example, in criminal investigations over the course of his career. This is the kind of work that he's done. And so, he was coming at it from a completely different perspective. There had been, a number of searchers. Obviously, there were historians who had theories as to what had happened to Franklin. But none of them were really looking. They were looking for artifacts. They were looking, of course, for the ships, which have since been found. But they were not looking at the human remains, and they were not learning, from the stories really that those bodies or those fragmentary remains might be able to tell about what had happened on the expedition. So this idea of applying, the tools of forensic science to a exploration mystery was novel and it was really a remarkable piece of forensic research, looking at the ultimate cold case, in this case, looking back over, more than a century at the human residue of this expedition, and trying to solve the mystery, or at least shed light on what happened to the men on that expedition.
So what actually happened to the crewmen of Terra and Erebus?
A number of really, I think, important observations that Owen made as a result of his research. He remains a professor emeritus at the University of Alberta, and it was University of Alberta research. He had a team of scholars, almost all from the University of Alberta, and they were really focused again on looking for clues from the human remains. So really important insights were gained. First of all, the expeditions focused on King William Island. That's the place where the final Franklin drama played out after the ships had been deserted by the crews, and the men were on the island. They were attempting to, at one point, or at least a number of the party were attempting to walk out of the Arctic. They were dragging lifeboats behind them, shambling down over these gravel islands, a very desolate part of the Arctic, and trying to reach help and get out of the Arctic that way. Their bodies, as the Inuit reported, they literally died as they walked along. So in some instances, their bodies were, on the surface, and he was actually able to locate with his team some of the human remains on the surface. Found even at one place where one of the Franklin crewmen had placed his last footstep and then collapsed. So he actually found a part of the body there at that site. Later, other scattered human remains around a site on the southern part of the island. So very interesting, observations gained from that. One of which was that the Inuit had always recounted that there had been cannibalism on the expedition. The idea that some of the Franklin crewmen may have resorted to cannibalism was something that outraged people in the United Kingdom. They did not want to accept the idea that Royal Navy sailors would resort to that. And there was clear evidence, Owen's expedition found clear evidence of cannibalism. There were cut marks on, in one instance, a femur. These were knife cut marks. They were made by a metal implement, not by the sorts of tools and implements that were used by the Inuit. And there was the sort of the nature of the remains that were found in the situation where there was a bone scatter that suggested that men were actually eating human remains and then discarding, bones outside the tent circle, the tent where they were situated. So that was an important observation. Another was that indeed, as historians had always surmised, scurvy did play a role in the deterioration of health on the expedition. That is the absence of vitamin C, fresh vegetables and meat was an issue. And then finally, of course, the most startling observation was this elevated level of lead, that there was a very high level of lead in the remains that suggested beyond simply lack of access to vitamins, but rather something more profound that was affecting the expedition.
Actually, I was about to ask you about this, the role the Inuit play in the story of not in the story of Franklin's expedition itself, but actually in explaining the mystery behind it. And actually, it was I noticed that it was Dickens who was really discrediting the Inuit tale about the cannibalism of the crewmen of Erebus. And I was wondering, could you please elaborate on how Inuit knowledges or Inuit reports fueled into this solving the mystery or actually helping the various expeditions to the area?
Well, I mean, the accounts, of course, were vital to and remain a vital part of the Franklin story. These are eyewitness accounts, sometimes handed down orally through several generations, but they were accounts of people who actually, in some instances, encountered surviving members of the expedition. There was, as you say, a view, I think a racist view that the Inuit themselves, if there had been any, for example, any cannibalism on the expedition, the likely culprits were the Inuit, not other Franklin expedition crewmen. This kind of pervasive ignorance that existed in Europe and other parts of the world with respect to indigenous people was certainly prevalent. But the fact remains that the Inuit did provide a great deal of intelligence, and searchers for Franklin, searchers for the expedition. I'm thinking of Charles Francis Hall, Lieutenant Frederick Schwatka. These are two American explorers. Actually paid a great deal of attention, as did Dr. John Ray, another searcher, a great deal of attention to the Inuit accounts. It's not as if the Inuit accounts were discarded or ignored. Really, the key problem was that they were not properly understood, that it was very difficult getting these fragments of information, these accounts, to sort of piece together the full picture of what had happened to the expedition. But the Inuit accounts were vital at the time of the early Franklin searches, and up until very recent time, Inuit accounts have been critical to understanding not only what happened to some of Franklin's men, but also, of course, the location of the two ships, Erebus and Terror, which have been found in recent years.
It's interesting because at one point in your book, you say that you claim that actually John Franklin expedition actually belongs to the area. It belongs to the Inuit as much as it belongs to the Canadian people and to the British. And I was wondering, how do you situate this story actually across cultures? Because, for instance, Margaret Atwood, in Margaret Atwood's short story, which was actually also inspired by your book, the Age of Lead, one of the characters there says that she learned, as a Canadian, she learned about the expedition, about Franklin's expedition and other expeditions in school. And I was wondering how this story actually fits across identity, not only the Inuit, but the Canadian and the British, because this is really interesting that a story of actually a colonist, a British expedition is actually has become a part of Canadian identity, if I'm correct to say.
Well, of course, Canada is evolved out of the British Empire, and Canada's claim to the Arctic islands, is rooted in British exploration history largely. So the fact that the Arctic archipelago, including King William Island and places like Somerset Island and Beechey Island, where Franklin's sailors, the first casualties were buried, are part of Canada, is because of British exploration history. So it was a continuum. The Canadian sovereignty is exercised in that part of the world because of those early, at least the foundation was those early British claims. Of course, Canada later stepped up, and the islands were formally transferred to Canada by the British government, to the Young Dominion of Canada. So, it's very much, what's interesting to me, it always has been interesting to me, is that the Franklin story, I think, is a much bigger story in Canada than it was in Britain after that initial period. Of course, at the time of the loss of the expedition, the searches, so we're talking late 1840s, 1850s, into maybe the early 1860s, there was a huge amount of interest in the UK, and Franklin was a very well-known person. But after that, the interest in the UK declined precipitously, I would say, and really it's in Canada where the interest in Franklin, because it was in our own backyard, if you will, that this happened, that the interest has remained. And of course, among the Inuit, I mean, these were interlopers. These were people who were not of their, of their world. They didn't understand the world that the Inuit existed, the realities that the Inuit faced. The Inuit had adopted, of course, life ways that allowed them to survive in this incredibly difficult environment, and in some instances to thrive. So suddenly you have this very large group of people who don't understand the environment. They don't understand what is needed to survive. And it posed a tremendous challenge, obviously, not just on the Franklin party, but from what we understand of the interactions with the Inuit were, not in a position really to lend the support and the help that was needed for a very, very large number of people who've suddenly shown up, on their shores. But with the discovery of the ships, and of course, starting with, I think, the research of Owen Beatty, interest in the UK has jumped dramatically, and Frozen Time is still in print in the UK. It's been in print, from the day it was published. It's never gone out of print. So there is of course, today a great deal of interest again in Franklin, and I think he's been restored to his rightful place as a major figure in polar exploration history.
Just to come back, because you mentioned this experience of men appearing, like a man coming, of people going to the Arctic, and as a member of various expeditions, for instance, one that was to discover the shipwrecks of Erebus, I think. Could you please share with our viewers some of the emotions or experiences that one feels when facing the Arctic?
Well, it's a very special part of the world. You know, I've been to Antarctica. I've been to Greenland. I've been to northern Finland. You know, this is a very stark, a very beautiful part of the world. It's unlike any other place I've been, and you know, there's a sense there because of the you know, the absence, obviously, of trees. You know, and the absence even of sort of classic tundra in many places. You know, you really do just get, you know, like King William Island, you know, gravel or rock covering, you know, island, rubble really, for as far as the eye can see. It's a very different sort of landscape. So everything seems somehow closer to you. History seems closer to you. So, you know, it's not surprising that you would walk on the surface of King William Island, as Owen did and his team did, and I've done it other occasions, and actually find artifacts, find things on the surface that have been there for, you know, since the 1840s in the case of Franklin. That's not an unusual experience. You will find Inuit burials, you know, there you'll see human remains often, or in some instances exposed because of time, because of animal activity. It's just, you know, it's part of a sort of a continuum. I don't think there's anywhere in the world where I've felt closer to history than I have, you know, in the Canadian Arctic. Everywhere else you get layers and layers of soil and growth and trees and leaves falling, and you know, it's just a very different place. So so you do feel when you're there a connection to the people who've been there before, whether the Inuit, of course, or the Thule or the other you know, people, the prehistoric peoples of the north, but also the you know, the exploration era visitors that are there.
And how about your expedition to search for the shipwreck? How did this come about, and was it any different from the land exploration? Because this was, I suppose, on ship, right? So on the Arctic Ocean.
Yeah, very, very different experience. I mean, as I say, I've been on field expeditions on land with Owen, a place called Marble Island off the northwest coast of Hudson Bay, and you know, it's a very we were spending a large period of time in one specific, you know, area doing archaeological investigations. Very different from the experience on the Victoria Strait expedition in 2014. That was the expedition that was led by Parks Canada. I was lucky to be part of it because the Royal Canadian Geographical Society was invited to partner with Parks Canada and try to help bring resources to support the work of the underwater archaeology team at Parks Canada, which is a Government of Canada agency. So I was up there on a ship. I was not on the ship that actually made the discovery, but we were all, you know, involved in different ways in that search. It was a really remarkable experience. Very exciting, of course, to finally, you know, when you know, Ryan Harrison and the dive team made that discovery of Erebus, an incredibly exhilarating moment, you know, because again, so many questions remained unanswered. The forensic work that Owen had undertaken shed a great deal of light on the health of individuals on the expedition, but the question remained: what happened to the ships? Where were they? Where were the logs that the men carried? And where were the bulk of the sailors? What had happened to them? Where were their bodies? It's as if, you know, they had simply vanished. And so to actually find a ship, to find it in the condition that I'm sure you've seen, and many of your viewers will have seen images of it, incredible condition. And then, you know, a short time later, the discovery of the second Franklin ship, HMS Terror, means that there's this incredible new wealth of information that's being brought to bear on the Franklin story. And yet, you know, it's one of those things that's very difficult to extract information that's in the ocean. It's very, you know, labor intensive. That the dive team goes back every year that they can. They've been slowed, of course, like everything else, because of the COVID pandemic. But you know, I think over the next few years, or over the next few decades, there will be tremendous growth in our knowledge of the Franklin mystery and what happened to those men.
Mm. And to your knowledge, are there any new information discovered so far and extracted from the shipwrecks, or this is still in the pipeline?
Yeah, I think much of it is still in the pipeline. But you know what is interesting is that the location of the ships is very, very interesting. And it, you know, there's I think the traditional view was that that likely both of the ships were crushed off the northwest coast of King William Island. The men were forced to land on King William Island and attempt to walk south to try to, you know, reach the mainland of Canada and eventually reach a Hudson's Bay Company trading post. That was the traditional, I think, accepted wisdom around Franklin. But what we've seen is something completely different, because the ships have been located. They're in remarkable condition. I mean, they're literally, you know, the cups and the cutlery are there. The things are sitting on desktops as they had been left by, you know, the occupants of the ship. And they do appear to have been remanned. There's evidence that the ships were in fact, if they had been deserted, as the famous note that was found on King William Island suggests, that they were subsequently remanned, and that the survivors remained aboard those ships for you know, some period of time, and may have even been successful in the case of Terror in steering it into kind of what would be considered to be a safe harbor. So it's a very interesting problem. The problem remains, and I think, you know, unless you know, actual logs are found and are able to be, you know, are preserved sufficiently to be accessed, you know, it's going to be hard to understand the sequence of events. Certainly, the Inuit oral tradition, the Inuit testimony has helped us a great deal in terms of understanding. But there's still a lot of questions and a lot of confusion around what happened.
And I'm just prepping for a talk. I found that the finding of Erebus and Terror, it was also important for the Canadian claim to the north. And actually, this is growing. This has become a hot topic, and the Arctic region is still contested and debated around Canada, Russia as well, and the United States. How do you think this story, the whole story, and those findings to come, how are they going to play in this debate or this issue?
Well, you know, this is a very, very age-old debate in Canada. The whole Arctic sovereignty debate in the early 1900s, when you had Robert Perry, the American explorer, and Frederick Cook up trying to reach the North Pole. Perry made a claim on the North Pole and all the lands around it. He also plotted an island he claimed called Croker Land, or a landmass. It might have been a new continent. There was a huge amount of interest, and there was there was definitely a scramble for you know, sovereignty over that, you know, over that part of the world. Norwegians were exploring in the Arctic. The Danes had suspected claims. The Americans were always, for Canada, were always a possible threat, because they had lots of capacity, you know, and we're up exploring as well. So it, you know, sovereignty has always been a big issue for Canada, and sovereignty over the Arctic. And yet, at the same time that we talk a lot about it and are concerned about it and are fiercely protective of the Arctic, you know, one of our sports teams in Toronto has as their slogan, "We the North," you know, "We the North." Yes, we the North, except that we don't invest enough in our North. You know, we don't have the capacity, the military capacity to properly defend the North. The Inuit really are the guardians and the custodians, perhaps as it should be, of the Arctic. But we don't have, for example, we have not had, and this is now being addressed, but even icebreakers in the Royal Canadian Navy. So there's not been a capacity for the Navy to patrol the Arctic in winter, which is most of the year in Arctic Canada. So of course the Coast Guard, the Canadian Coast Guard, has that capacity and is in the Arctic. But yeah, it's definitely been an issue. So this was an opportunity, I think, for the government of the day, the discovery of the ships, to underscore that continuum that I was talking about, the fact that the British period of exploration, Franklin, Ross, Edward Perry, all these figures fed into this narrative that continues to this day, that when Britain transferred the Arctic archipelago to Canada in 1880, Canada then assumed responsibility, and it's all part of a common story. And I think that the discovery of the ships and the reignited interest, just as the work described in Frozen in Time reignited interest in this incredible epoch of history, this incredibly adventurous era, and the discoveries that were made. So it's significant, but I don't think it had any bearing over actual legal law of the sea type claims. It's more of a reclaiming the Arctic, high Arctic in the imagination.
Okay, and for as our talk is coming to a close, I would like to ask you, having lived with the Franklin story for so many years now, what lesson do you personally draw from his fate and the fate of his crewmen?
Well, I mean, he's been over the years, he's become a figure of some criticism for a perceived failure to learn from the Inuit. You compare Franklin as an example to Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer, who made on this little tiny vessel called Yoa, made a successful first transit of the Northwest Passage. The approach so different from that of Franklin and Amundsen. Amundsen learning from the Inuit, actually studying, remaining with them, living with them, and learning from them, learning lessons that were later applied to his very successful South Polar expedition. He learned, things that no European could know. For example, that if you spat into your fur glove and then rub that on the runners of your sledge, that would help it move more quickly over in wetter snow, and so just basic methodologies that he picked up from the Inuit and later applied successfully in the race to the South Pole. I think that Franklin could have taken a very different approach, and the irony is that he had been on 2 overland expeditions to the Arctic coast himself. The first very difficult, troubled, and with a startling number of deaths. The second, very successful. Franklin led the effort that really mapped much of the northern coast of the North American continent prior to his expedition. So he knew the area. He knew what it took to survive in that region, and yet he led an expedition with 2 large ships and a bunch of men who never experienced the Arctic, knew nothing of the conditions, knew nothing about survival in that area. So it's a difficult problem. It was very much a cultural disjuncture, but there was also some lessons that were not learned by Franklin that ought to have been learned, I think, and would have likely saved lives had they been learned.
Thank you very much, and I'm really happy that we ended on the on the note that this actually what we can learn from this, learn from his thoughts, and learn from his tragic story is to actually embrace diversity and embrace indigenous ways of living that could actually help us. And I'm really thankful for this and for this conclusion of our talk. And I hope our viewers will read this book, Na zawsze w lodzie. Thank you very much, John Geiger, for your time. And I hope we'll see each other at other point maybe in the Arctic. As this,
that would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Look forward to that. Thank you.